For this introduction, I understand I have 15 minutes, so I have 15 slides, and it's 1 minute per slide. So we'll see how that goes. First, the question is, what is postmodernism? And the name is by the movement chosen carefully. Modernism means that it sees itself as positioning itself against modernism or after modernism. So the first question is, what then is modernism, such that the postmoderns see themselves as reacting against or arguing against, in some respect. So here, for example, Michel Foucault, perhaps the most famous of the postmodern thinkers, arguing that we live in historically pregnant times, that it's the end of an era, And the way he puts it here is saying that the deepest strata of Western culture have been exposed and are once more stirring under our feet. So Western culture for some centuries has been on a certain foundation, but that foundation is being subjected to an earthquake, or some sort of natural faults are causing it to crumble and break down. Richard Rorty, perhaps the most famous of the American postmodernists, arguing that as a postmodernist, what they're trying to do is figure out what we're supposed to do, now that the two previous eras that dominated Western civilization, the age of faith, as he calls it, and the age of enlightenment, they both seem beyond recovery. So they are both, in Rorty's postmodern estimate, failures, intellectually and in terms of their cultural manifestation. And that's our postmodern predicament. Now, both Rorty and Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and all of the pantheon of postmodern thinkers will cite the Enlightenment as the intellectual framework that dominated modernism. Modernism is a historical era, but its intellectual self-identification was realized and institutionalized in the Enlightenment, broadly speaking, of the 1700s. So what I have here is a flow chart, and I'll just talk very briefly through it. But what distinguished the birth of modernism, according to most historians, is a transition from an era dominated by reliance on authority, reliance upon tradition, upon faith, upon being certain established texts. And what we find at the beginning of the modern era is an emphasis on reason, the great philosophers here being John Locke, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and others. And all of them are modern because they make reason fundamental, the capacity of the individual mind to come to know reality. And that then is a huge shift from an uncritical reliance on a preset set of dogmas or traditions that one is not going fundamentally to criticize. And the argument then is that from all of that, the entire modern project follows. For example, I didn't want that one. If you go down to the bottom there, science then is a consequence of the modern project. If you are committed to reason and trying to understand the world rationally, then it makes sense, as it did happen starting in the 1600s with increasing speed on through the 1700s, to see physics become a science, chemistry become a science, biology becomes a science, and so science as a prominent, deep feature of the modern world. It didn't exist 600 years ago, but nonetheless, that is a consequence of a deep commitment to reasoning. Science, then, if we apply it to inanimate objects, means engineering with the dramatic transformation of the world by the Industrial Revolution is part of the modern product. If we try to understand human beings ourselves through a rational lens, we get rid of traditional medicines, old wives' tales with apologies to old wives, astrological remedies, prayer, seeing things as perhaps punishments from God, and see the human being as part of the natural world, that we can understand how we work through cause and effect. Then you're going to get modern medicine and its transformation coming into existence. And you start to see that in the late 1600s, 1700s, and then again picking up steam. So Reason, science, modern medicine, technology are fundamental features of modernism, and they are institutionalized in the Enlightenment. But there's also a value or a normative component, right, to the modern world, a transformation that occurred there. If we take reason seriously, right, when we think that reason is something that goes on in each individual's mind, that we each have the capacity for reason, whether we choose to exercise it or not, that's of course up to us. But if reason is important, then it becomes important that each individual, right, think for himself or herself, and that we start culturally to encourage people to think for themselves. We understand, of course, that people will, as individuals, come to have different ideas. There's going to be lots of debate and discussion, and people are going to come up with obnoxious ideas that we despise. But what that means also is we still have to respect that other person's coming up with different ideas and thinking through for themselves. And so when we disagree, we will have to disagree as reasonable people do, and that's by discussion, debate, trying to change people's minds. And so also individualism starts to become an important component in the early modern world. Now, if you start to take the individual seriously, instead of seeing people just as part of a class group or some ethnic alien other group and so forth, that has very serious economic implications and very serious political implications. And also in the modern world, it wasn't just revolutionary in the science or in the engineering, it was revolutionary in the economics and in the politics. So, for example, in the politics, the rise of liberalism, the breaking down of feudalism, individuals, no matter what their original class membership, are free to move about the country, leave the country, go into whatever lines of work that they want, deal with other people, participate in the political process, run for office. Broadly speaking, we get the democratic, republican, free market, capitalist revolutions going on in politics and economics. Now, the dates are, of course, important here. In the 1600s, there's a philosophical revolution. By the end of the 1600s and on into the 1700s, you can see individualism and science as institutions prominent. The political and economic revolutions are occurring in the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution, and the birth of modern medicine also in the 1700s. And then those trends all carry on into the 1800s, the 1900s, and we have the modern world that we live in now. That is modernism. And the first thesis of postmodernism is, and this is in milder forms of postmodernism, that all of that is an unstable, philosophically, ultimately bankrupt intellectual system that got institutionalized, and it has led to all sorts of pathological negative results in current culture. That it's an unsustainable cultural enterprise because intellectually it is bankrupt. And then the more cynical, right, versions of postmodernism are to argue that all of that really was a fraud and a cover story for a deeper understanding of what really goes on in society and so forth. But let me give you some intros here. One of the important points within postmodernism, we hear a lot about skepticism, about relativism, in literary forms about deconstruction. So here is Foucault really going after the Enlightenment project at its root, saying reason is a sham, reason is a fraud. And notice how strong this statement is, right? That it's meaningless to talk about reason. It's meaningless to say that we can talk meaningfully about truth, right? Or it's meaningless to believe that there is such a thing as knowledge. Those are all things that the Enlightenment took seriously, but they are all empty, just sounds coming out of people's mouths that carry no content. And this is then the skeptical strain. If we take seriously a cognitive skepticism, where is that going to lead us? Because clearly the Enlightenment was based on a very optimistic view that we could come to know something about reality. And so the first thing I want to put out there is that there was, and there still is within Postmodernism, a very serious grappling with cognitive issues and epistemological issues, but from a very negative, skeptical standpoint. In my story, I trace things back to Immanuel Kant, on through a wave of irrationalist thinking that dominated particularly German philosophy in the 19th century, picked up steam in thinkers like Martin Heidegger in the early part of the 20th century, and then manifested itself in the postmodernists. And it's interesting that all of the major postmodernists will say, we are taking our cues from Heidegger, and they will hearken back to the 19th century irrationalist thinkers like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and then behind them stand Immanuel Kant. So I just have one quotation from Nietzsche here, arguing that really it's Kant who marks the turning point. I agree with Nietzsche on this point. If you want to understand why the skepticism came to dominate, it really is Kant's arguments that one has to grapple with. And for 2 centuries, philosophers and others have been grappling with Kant's arguments and reaching very skeptical conclusions. So epistemology certainly is important. Now there's a biographical point here that I want to make. One of the interesting things about all of the leading postmodernists, and here I've got 4 of them, Lyotard, Foucault, Rorty, and Derrida, they actually were all born within a 7-year span, right? Okay. So they are a part of it. They all came of age in the 1950s. They're all extremely smart. They all got PhDs, and they all got PhDs in philosophy. And a big part of their philosophical training was grappling with the cutting-edge theories of knowledge and the skeptical epistemology that was dominating philosophy both in the continental tradition and in the analytic tradition in the 1950s. So that's one part of the analysis of the story. Where does all this skepticism and relativism and this idea that there's no truth, right, and so forth come from? There's a deep story there. The other part of the story that gets emphasized is politics. And here I have another American postmodernist, Fredric Jameson. He's kind of a neo-Marxist, but he has this very pregnant line here that wants to say that everything, right, in the last analysis, right, is political, right? And that picks up on the sense that with postmodernism, politics is always very close to the surface, or and sometimes it's explicitly, right, a matter of reading everything through a political lens, right? It's a politically critical discipline, and of course a very intellectually sophisticated one. But it's also a very interesting, narrow brand of politics that is typically brought to bear. And here, Jacques Derrida, a quotation from him mentioning deconstruction, which is kind of the literary application of postmodernism, saying that in fact, postmodernism, right, is from his perspective a political application. It's sort of an application to literature of a certain strand of Marxism, right, that it's part of a Marxist strategy, right, in some sense or other. And here the interesting thing is all of the major postmodernists of the first generation are not only from the left end of the spectrum, from a fairly narrow element of the left end of the spectrum. Foucault was a member of the French Communist Party. Derrida hung around with French communists and published in the journals, as did Jean-Francois Lyotard. In the American context, Richard Rorty is a social democrat, and obviously, you know, the spectrum shifts to some extent when you move over to the United States, but from the American context, he is about as left as you can go. And I would just put it to you, if you run through the top 30 or 40 most famous postmodernists worldwide, they all come from one end, right, of the political spectrum. So politics is in a way very important to postmodernism. And there's an interesting puzzle here that I want to put out, and that is, if we're skeptical, if we're relativist, if we don't think there's really truth, knowledge, and so forth, those which are very, of course, prominent postmodernist themes, then when people start doing politics, where should they end up? Well, they should be all over the map, right? If there's no truth, if it's just whatever, right, subjectively, right, you feel like, well, people feel all sorts of things when it comes to politics. You should find postmodernists all over the map, but you don't. They're coming from one part of the political spectrum. So my main thesis about postmodernism is that it's a combination of a certain political strategy joined with a philosophical strategy. right? It's a kind of left politics. It's not the only kind of left politics, but it's a left politics joined with a very skeptical philosophy. And again, I want to just say a few things about the 50s as important here. All of the first generation leading postmodernists were coming of age. They're all in their 20s, getting their PhDs in philosophy, but all of them are very engaged with far left politics in the 1950s. And if you're a leftist, the 1950s were a disaster, right, for you, right, politically. That was a great crisis decade for left thought, where the deepest thinkers are reacting to a certain set of crises and saying, what are we going to do next? We need a new strategy. The strategy we have been following for 1 century since the Communist Manifesto is not working. We need to do something different. Now, in hindsight, we know that the new left comes out of that. The shift to Maoism comes to that. Leftism splinters into a whole bunch of sub-movements in the 1960s. It was all born of the 1950s. And there are any number of fascinating history issues that are going on in the development of left politics that culminate in the 1950s. So I think grappling with that political movement is part of the understanding of where postmodernism, right, come from. Now, I only have a few minutes, so I just want to wrap up. I've been very negative here. And the argument, of course, is a deep argument. What do we think the nature of the world that we are living in? Is it a fraud? Is it a sham? Is it a world that we should be critically and unrelentingly negative against, as postmodernism typically is? Is it a mixed bag of good and bad, or is it a place where actually we have achieved a lot significantly in the last couple of centuries? And I just want to give a couple of pointers because I'm much more optimistic, right? So if we actually evaluate the track record of modernism and the Enlightenment, right, how have things gone? I'm just going to give you one set of gaps here. This is from Gapminder. I'm sure you all know, right? Okay, so it's a perfect. I use these charts all the time in my classes. I love Hans Rosling. I'm in the fan club, right, and so on. Okay. All right, so here what we have is income right across the bottom, life expectancy right on the vertical axis, and then this is in 1812. Those are all of the countries in the world, and then they're color-coded according to what continent, right, they are from. So that is to say, all of the countries in the world, right, people are average life expectancy in the 30s, right? That's what it had been for tens of thousands of years. That was the historical norm, right? And income, right, in the, what is that? The rich people in the world on average are earning between, or almost $2,000 a year, right? And everybody else is down there. All right, this is when the Enlightenment is being institutionalized. The Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution, Free Market Revolution, the Democratic Revolutions, and so forth. What happens in 1 century? All right, that happens. Right, a significant number of countries. These are actually all of the European countries here, and these are the North American countries. My home country, Canada, right, trying to catch up to the United States, right, not doing too badly. And then 1 more century. That's 1912, just before World War I. This is 2012. Okay. That is awesome. All of the poor countries, these unfortunately are mostly African countries, but if you go back 200 years, all of the African countries that we go to now and we say the poverty is awful, life expectancy is awful in those countries, they are far, far richer and living far, far longer than the richest people were living 200 centuries ago. So that's some significance. This is just Sweden, life expectancy. This is life expectancy in Sweden in 1800. It's in the low 30s, right? This is life expectancy in Sweden as of about 5 years ago. That's a beautiful thing, right? Right. So my point is, right, we have made some progress. I think the Enlightenment gets some props, but it does depend on a certain philosophical understanding. Taking reason seriously, taking individualism seriously, taking science seriously, right, and so forth. So the stakes are high in understanding where the postmoderns are coming from. They do have some powerful arguments, they do have to be understood, but I also think they need to be combated. So I'll stop there.